Throughout history, humanity has devised some of the most horrifying and unimaginable methods of execution and torture, pushing the limits of cruelty and suffering. From the gruesome blood rituals of the Norse to the slow agonies of the Persian boats, these punishments have left dark imprints in the annals of time. Join me as we delve into some of the most nightmarish techniques ever conceived by man, where pain knew no boundaries and death was often a merciful escape. The Brazen Bull. A woman's screams turned to music. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and burning oil from the torches that lined the grand hall. In the center of the room stood the Brazen Bull, a gleaming hollow monstrosity of polished bronze, its lifeless eyes staring into the abyss of the chamber. The woman, shackled at the wrists and ankles, struggled against her captors, her breath ragged with terror. She had begged, pleaded, and cursed in the days leading up to this moment, but now she was silent. She knew there was no mercy left to find. The executioners moved without urgency. They had done this before. The bull had feasted on many before her, and it would feast again. The ruler of the city, perched high upon his throne, watched with mild interest, swirling a goblet of wine in his hand. To him this was a spectacle, a lesson to those who dared to defy his rule. The punishment was as much a message as it was a death sentence. The blacksmiths had been working for hours, feeding wood into the gaping maw of the furnace below the bull's belly. The air around it shimmered with the rising heat, and already, touching the beast's metal surface, would peel skin from flesh. But this was only the beginning. The true horror had yet to unfold. Her feet dragged across the stone floor, her nails scraping against the walls as she fought with every ounce of strength she had left. The guards tightened their grip, lifting her up to the open hatch carved into the bull's side. The interior was cramped, a suffocating space barely large enough to contain her. The moment she saw the inside, she understood. The realization clawed through her mind like a wild animal. This was not just an execution, it was an orchestration of suffering. As they forced her inside, the heat of the bronze walls was already unbearable, and she shrieked in pain. The metal was hot enough to scald, but not yet to kill. That was the cruelty of it. The suffering was meant to be slow. They sealed the hatch behind her, the iron locks clanking into place. Trapped inside, her ragged breaths echoed back at her. The air was thick, the space so tight that she could hardly move. She slammed her fists against the walls, screaming, but the only answer she received was the laughter of the gathered crowd outside. Then the fire roared to life beneath her. The heat grew unbearable in mere moments, searing through her flesh like molten hands tearing her apart. She screamed, raw and inhuman, the agony breaking her mind apart. But outside, those screams did not reach the ears of the crowd in the way one might expect. The bull was not just a torture device, it was an instrument. Pipes had been crafted into its mouth, designed to turn the screams of the victim into eerie, twisted music. The more she shrieked, the more the bull sang. The ruler leaned forward on his throne, nodding in approval as the sound filled the chamber. It was horrifying and mesmerizing all at once. The gathered nobles listened as if attending a grand performance. Inside the bull, her body twisted and convulsed, her skin blistering, her lungs filling with the scorching air. The walls grew hotter and hotter until she could no longer support herself. Her hands and knees seared against the metal, but there was nowhere to escape. Every breath she took was like inhaling fire, scorching her from the inside out. Her screams became weaker. Her body, no longer able to fight, slumped against the burning walls. The once vibrant howls of agony faded, the twisted music of the Brazen Bull growing silent. When the last breath left her charred lungs, the crowd outside erupted into applause. The execution had been successful. The ruler smiled, lifting his goblet in a toast. The blacksmiths waited until the bull had cooled before prying open the hatch. A gust of putrid burnt air spilled into the chamber. Inside, all that remained was a blackened corpse, its flesh melded to the walls of its prison, its mouth still open in a final, silent scream. The executioners moved in to scrape the remains free, the metal slick with the residue of death. Tomorrow, the bull would be ready for another performance. The sawing. A woman torn in half. The torches flickered against the damp stone walls, casting monstrous shadows that danced like restless spirits. The woman, bound at the wrists and ankles, lay motionless, her breathing shallow. She had spent the last 3 days in a dark cell, shackled to the cold floor, denied food, denied water. Weakness gripped her limbs, and yet terror was far stronger than any exhaustion. She knew what was coming. She had heard the screams of others before her. The executioners, faceless figures in heavy robes, prepared the tool of her suffering. A massive saw, its serrated edge glinting with a wicked hunger, was carried into the chamber. The crowd gathered, murmuring in anticipation, for this was no ordinary death. This was a spectacle, a slow, deliberate dissection of the living, and she was the chosen performance. 2 men approached her, their hands rough and unfeeling. They stripped her of what little clothing remained, exposing her fragile, trembling form to the leering audience. Shame burned in her eyes, but fear quickly swallowed it whole. She thrashed, her body screaming for freedom even as her mind told her there was none. They lifted her, turning her upside down so that her head hung low, her feet pointing toward the heavens. A thick wooden beam stood in the center of the chamber, and to it they tied her legs apart. Her arms dangled limply, fingers twitching as if reaching for salvation that would never come. The saw was positioned between her legs, its jagged teeth resting just above her most vulnerable place. The crowd hushed, waiting. A signal was given. The executioners took their places, 1 man on each side, each gripping the long wooden handles. And then they began. The first pull of the saw was slow, agonizingly deliberate. The metal teeth bit into her flesh, slicing through skin with ease. She shrieked, her body jerking violently against the restraints. Blood seeped from the wound, dribbling down her stomach, pooling in her hair as it dripped to the stone below. The saw's path was merciless. It tore through muscle next, the fibers ripping apart as the men pulled the blade back and forth in a dreadful rhythm. Her screams filled the chamber, raw and desperate, yet no one looked away. The crowd leaned in closer, watching as the saw made its relentless descent. The pain was beyond comprehension, white-hot, searing, unbearable. She fought, her body convulsing, but the position she was in ensured that all the blood rushed to her head. It kept her alive. It made sure she would feel every second of it. The saw reached bone. A sickening crunch echoed through the chamber as it ground against her pelvis. The executioners did not slow. They worked steadily, their arms straining, sweat mixing with the blood that sprayed up from the wound. Her shrieks turned into ragged gasps, her body weakening with each unbearable second. The blade traveled downward, splitting her apart from groin to belly. Her intestines bulged from the gaping wound, slipping free as the saw continued its descent. She was still alive, still aware, still suffering. Her ribs cracked as the saw bit deeper, her body jerking one final time before all movement ceased. But the executioners did not stop. They would not stop until the saw reached her skull, until her body was cleaved fully in two, until nothing remained but a grotesque mess of flesh and bone. The two halves of her body finally collapsed to the ground, a steaming pile of gore. The crowd erupted into applause, their thirst for horror sated, for now. The executioners wiped the saw clean, preparing it for the next unfortunate soul. Somewhere in the darkness of the chamber, another prisoner listened, another woman, another victim. She knew her turn was coming, and there was no escape. He-blood eagle, wings of agony. The scent of damp earth mixed with the thick metallic tang of blood in the frozen air. The woman knelt in the center of the wooden platform, her breath visible in the cold. Her arms were bound in front of her, her wrists raw from the rough rope digging into her flesh. Around her the warriors of the north stood in grim silence, their faces unreadable beneath their heavy furs. This was not a simple execution. This was an offering to the gods, a message to the weak, a spectacle of horror. She had been accused of treachery, whether true or not did not matter now. The Jarl had made his decision, and the punishment was to be the blood eagle. A death so cruel, so agonizing, that even the most hardened warriors whispered of it in hushed tones. Few had seen it performed. Fewer still had survived long enough to witness the end. The executioner stepped forward, a massive man with a face like carved stone. In his hands, he held a blade, its edge sharp enough to slice through flesh like butter. The woman trembled but did not beg. She knew there was no mercy here, only pain. Without a word, the executioner pressed the blade against the skin of her back, just below the nape of her neck. The first cut was slow, deliberate, splitting her flesh open in a thin crimson line. She inhaled sharply, her body going rigid, but she did not scream. Not yet. The blade moved again, deeper this time, peeling the skin away like the hide of a hunted deer. The crowd watched in absolute silence as her back was methodically flayed open, revealing the shifting muscles beneath. Blood streamed down her sides, pooling at her knees, but still she did not cry out. Then came the ribs. The executioner adjusted his grip, now wielding a crude axe. The first strike landed with a sickening crack, shattering the bones just below her shoulder blades. A scream tore from her throat, raw and piercing, echoing into the darkened sky. Again the axe fell. Again the bones splintered. The pain was unbearable, white-hot lightning shooting through every nerve in her body. Her vision blurred, but she remained conscious. She had to. If she lost herself to the void, the gods would not be appeased. The punishment would be for nothing. The ribs were pried open one by one, the jagged bones bent backward, forced apart like the opening of a great set of wings. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her lungs, once protected, now lay exposed to the icy air, quivering with each labored inhale. The pain was beyond anything she had ever known, beyond what she had ever imagined. The final stage was near. The executioner reached into her open chest cavity, his hands slick with her lifeblood. With a brutal tug, he wrenched her lungs free from their confines, draping them over her shoulders like grotesque blood-drenched wings. The sight was unholy, a twisted mimicry of flight, a mockery of freedom. She was still alive, barely. Her body twitched, her lips parting as if to whisper a prayer, but no sound came. The cold air rushed into her exposed organs, an unbearable sensation that sent her into the final throes of agony. And then, at last, the darkness came. Her body slumped forward, the gruesome wings of bone and flesh glistening in the firelight. The warriors nodded in approval. The sacrifice was complete. The gods had been honored. The blood eagle had claimed another soul. The boats, a feast for the vermin. The sun hung heavy in the sky, an indifferent witness to the horror that was about to unfold. The river's surface shimmered, deceptively calm, as if it had not been chosen to cradle death this day. The woman lay on her back inside a wooden boat, her wrists and ankles bound with thick rope. She struggled, but the more she moved, the tighter the bindings cut into her swollen skin. Above her, men in dark robes moved with eerie precision, their faces void of emotion. She had been accused of blasphemy, of daring to defy the will of those who claimed divine power. Her punishment was to be an example. something so gruesome, so beyond comprehension, that no one would dare question authority again. She had heard rumors of this torture. The boats, they called it. A death so slow and revolting that even the executioners took no pleasure in their work. 2 boats had been prepared, each hollowed out to form a perfect coffin. One boat held her writhing body. The second would soon be placed on top, sealing her in a wooden prison. But the method of death was not so simple. They had plans for her, plans that would make her beg for an end long before it arrived. Her clothes were torn away, leaving her bare beneath the scorching sun. The air was thick with the stink of stagnant water and rotting vegetation, but soon another stench would join it. A slave knelt beside her, holding a bowl filled with thick, honeyed milk. Without a word, he lifted it to her lips, forcing the sickly sweet liquid into her mouth. She turned her head away, but hands gripped her jaw, forcing her to drink. Again and again, they filled her mouth with the mixture, pouring more than she could swallow. It dribbled down her chin, coating her body in a sticky sheen. The warmth of the sun made it worse, the honey clinging to her like a second skin. And then they waited. At first, nothing happened. The crowd grew restless, whispering among themselves. But then the insects came. Flies, drawn by the scent, descended upon her, their tiny legs crawling over her lips, her eyes, her ears. They stuck to her skin, wings buzzing as they fed greedily from the syrupy coating. Her stomach churned, a new pain building within her. The milk, laced with a cruel purpose, had worked its way into her gut, forcing her bowels into a relentless, uncontrollable purge. She sobbed as the filth ran down her legs, pooling beneath her in the boat. The stink was unbearable, but it was not the worst part. The worst part was that it invited more visitors. The second boat was placed over her, leaving only her head, hands, and feet exposed. The world grew darker inside her wooden tomb, the heat stifling, the smell suffocating. Then they pushed her out onto the water, where the boat rocked gently, swaying as if singing her a lullaby. The hours stretched into days. The sun baked her skin, blisters forming where the light touched her. Her stomach writhed in agony, the forced feeding continuing at intervals to prolong her misery. The honey and milk ensured that her body remained a living feast, drawing not just flies, but worse things. The maggots came first. Hatched within the filth that clung to her body, they burrowed into her flesh, wriggling beneath the surface. She could feel them moving, chewing, devouring her inch by inch. Her screams echoed over the water, but there was no one to save her. The river had become her grave. Then came the rats. Drawn by the stench of rot, they swam through the murky water, their teeth eager, their hunger insatiable. They crawled onto the edges of the boat, their beady eyes locked onto the exposed parts of her body. The first bite was sharp, a tiny blade sinking into her toe. Then another, and another. She kicked, but the bindings held her still, leaving her at their mercy. Her mind fractured. Time became meaningless. The pain, the filth, the ceaseless agony, it all blurred together into one endless nightmare. The flesh rotted from her bones, yet they did not let her die. They ensured she remained aware, kept feeding her just enough to prolong the suffering. By the time the gods finally took pity on her, days, perhaps weeks, had passed. The boat, still floating on the cursed river, no longer held a woman. It held something unrecognizable, a shell of decay and writhing filth. When they retrieved the boat, the only thing left of her was bone, sinew, and the gnawing mouths of the creatures that had feasted upon her. The execution was complete. The message had been sent. The boats had claimed another soul, the Pear of Anguish, a mouthful of agony. The stone walls of the dungeon oozed with dampness, the air thick with the stench of sweat, old blood, and decay. The woman knelt in the center of the chamber, her arms bound behind her back, her ankles shackled so tightly that the metal bit into her flesh. She had been dragged here from her cell, barely able to walk, her body already bruised and battered from the interrogations that had led her to this moment. She was accused of blasphemy, of fornication, of witchcraft, though no proof was needed. A whispered rumor, a vengeful neighbor, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time was enough. Now she knelt before the hooded figure, the Inquisitor, the bringer of pain, and she knew her fate was sealed. The crowd of officials and nobles leaned forward, eager to witness the device they had all heard whispers about, the Pear of Anguish, a relic of pure cruelty, an instrument designed not for quick death, but for the slow and deliberate destruction of the human body. The executioner stepped forward, holding it aloft, and the torchlight gleamed on its metallic surface. It resembled a simple, unassuming metal pear, smooth and rounded. But at its base, a cruel mechanism lay hidden, 4 curved metal segments designed to expand outward when twisted. It was a device of exquisite horror, one that had been used before and would be used again. The woman's breath hitched as she recognized it, her eyes widening in realization. The executioner turned to his master, awaiting the command. The Inquisitor, a man of cold precision, nodded once. The punishment was to begin. 2 guards stepped forward, gripping the woman's jaw with ironclad hands. She fought, her teeth clenching, her screams muffled behind her lips. But resistance was pointless. A sharp slap cracked across her face, her head snapping to the side. The pain was enough to make her gasp, and in that moment of weakness, the device was forced between her lips. The cold metal pressed against her tongue, the taste of iron filling her mouth. She gagged, her body convulsing, but they did not remove it. No, this was only the beginning. The executioner grasped the small screw at the end of the device and began to turn. At first, the change was slight. A faint pressure, an uncomfortable stretching sensation as the metal segments inside her mouth began to expand. But then, with each slow twist, the pressure grew unbearable. The walls of her cheeks stretched taut, her jaw forced wider than nature intended. Her muffled screams were drowned out by the grotesque pops and cracks as her jawbone dislocated with a sickening snap. Tears streamed down her face, her vision blurred by agony. The Inquisitor watched without emotion, only gesturing for the executioner to continue. The screw twisted again. The metal jaws of the device stretched farther, her mouth now a gaping, unnatural chasm. Blood trickled from the corners of her lips, her gums torn from the force, her tongue crushed beneath the expanding pressure. Her body spasmed, but she could not move. The pain radiated through her skull, stabbing into her temples, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The tendons in her neck bulged, her throat convulsing as she struggled to breathe. The agony was immeasurable, like being split apart from the inside out, her very bones betraying her in the slow, torturous expansion. And yet they did not stop. The device continued its cruel work, the final twist forcing her jaw to the brink of destruction. Her body sagged, her consciousness slipping as her nerves reached the threshold of what they could endure. But she was not given the mercy of darkness. Cold water splashed over her head, shocking her awake. The Inquisitor wanted her to feel it all. A final turn of the screw, and her jaw was no longer a part of her body. It was a shattered ruin. The bones cracked beyond repair, the skin of her face stretched and torn. Blood filled her throat, choking her, drowning her in her own suffering. Only then did the executioner stop. With a deliberate, almost mocking slowness, he twisted the screw backward, allowing the metal petals to close. Her mouth, once so violently forced open, now collapsed in on itself, a useless, broken maw that could no longer scream. The device was pulled free, coated in blood and saliva. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing in a final, pathetic attempt at survival. But there was no more survival for her. The damage was done. She would never speak again, never eat, never exist as anything more than a grotesque reminder of what happened to those who defied authority. The Inquisitor gave a nod of approval. The lesson had been taught. The body, now ruined, would be discarded like the broken thing it had become. The Pear of Anguish had done its work.